The year was 1974. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson had just finished their release of Dungeons & Dragons, the famous role-playing tabletop game. It was massively successful and went on to become a staple of the board game scene from the 70s up until now. But little did they know that they had planted a seed. This seed would grow to change video games as we knew them forever. But how did this become this? You may not think it, but the answer is complex. This is the history of the Japanese role-playing game. So how did the seed of D&D begin to grow? The game already had all the basic mechanics of an RPG, such as a leveling system, classes, and races. Why even make a video game? But there was one problem with D&D. It wasn't accessible, and it could be streamlined. And so the West and the East set off on a quest to create the digital Dungeon Master and streamline the game. It was from here that the two main RPGs that would inspire a generation came into existence. There was Wizardry, a wireframe RPG, in which you traveled in a first-person perspective, and Ultima, the first RPG with real-time combat and a top-down perspective. Wizardry's combat handled all the numbers digitally, allowing for a much faster experience. Ultima managed to actually situate you within the world so that you could roam around. But here's the ironic thing. Even these games could be streamlined. Wizardry and Ultima required a lot of knowledge and were difficult to learn. This limited their audience to people who were willing to spend the time to sit down and teach themselves the complex systems. The West decided it was best to leave these games as they were and continued to cater to a hardcore PC audience. However, a man from Japan named Yuji Nori thought differently.
ゲームってすごく面白いシステムだと思うんだけども、当時すごいマニアックだったと思うんですよ。それを僕的には家庭用ゲーム機に落としてですね、本当にほとんどそういう難しいことを知らなくてもですね、楽しめるゲームにしようと思って作ってですね。He partnered with Koichi Nakamura and Akira Toriyama, creator of Dragon Ball, to create Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest would combine both Wizardry and Ultima to make the most accessible and commercially successful JRPG franchise yet. It took the menu combat from Wizardry and the overworld from Ultima while streamlining the systems of both. It took a few sequels for Dragon Quest to reach the height of its success, but its height greenlighted the development of a little game by Squaresoft called Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy became the next development in the RPG franchise. It kept the Ultima-like overworld, but changed the Wizardry-inspired combat of Dragon Quest to include a menu where you could see your party perform attacks. While this is something we take for granted today, this menu was actually revolutionary for the time. It was the first time you could see your characters actually attack. Once Final Fantasy came out, the JRPG had finally begun to look as it does now. Two influential games, Wizardry and Ultima, had inspired another pair of incredibly influential titles. However, some questions are still left to be answered. For example, how did all the differences of JRPGs and Western RPGs really come about? I've already mentioned the difference of accessibility versus hardcore audience, but there are many other differences too. For example, Western RPGs insert their player into the story and allow them to have control over it to a certain extent. JRPGs have instead prioritized being part of a group and playing as a protagonist that is different from the player. How in the world did these differences come about? Part of the answer has to do with one of the biggest factors of the RPG's history. It was developed simultaneously in two different places. Both the USA and Japan had access to Dungeons & Dragons, and so they had the opportunity to begin developing the RPG at the same time. The platformer is different, for example, because it began in Japan and then was emulated in the US. Emulating a genre leads to a more content-sensitive development, but the RPG has had a two-pronged path since its beginnings. There's also the theory derived from differences in American and Japanese cultures. America is a very individualistic society. We live to tell our own story and make a name for ourselves. Japan, however, is a much more communal society. It has an extremely low crime rate because of the consequences one person's crimes have on the reputation of the group. This seems to be the clearest difference between cultures that has inspired the narratives and activities associated with these two very different genres. This theory still ranks as highly speculative. I don't even think the game developers themselves could come up with a clear answer as to whether this is true, but it presents an interesting explanation. Hopefully you can see by now that the history of the JRPG is complex. Something as simple as a single video game genre can open up a world of conversation about culture, creativity, and why we want the experiences we want. I would encourage you to think about the following questions. What does an RPG do for a person? What really makes an RPG fun? How do we come to this idea of fun?
I think that the long-time establishment of the JRPG has made us take for granted the idea that the RPG is a fun experience, but diving into the why enters a depth many will never sink their teeth into.